Welcome to the Legion Strength and Conditioning Podcast. You can check us out at legionsc.com or follow us on Instagram at legion.sc. All right, so at the end of a training session, some athletes feel like they could have done more, that they did some intervals and they were breathing heavy, but it wasn't so bad, that they hit a tough single on a front squat and they maybe had a few more pounds in the tank. And if they had done a few more sets, they could have maybe set a personal record. And that there was just more in the tank for the session. And a question that athletes sometimes have is like, hey, am I, leaving gains on the table if I feel like I have more in the tank at the end of the session, right? Should I have emptied it out in that session? Should I have hit that personal record? Should I have gone faster on my intervals? Should I have potentially just done more volume in that session if I feel like there's a lot more there? And, there's not necessarily a super clear answer to that, because as coaches, we sometimes do design sessions that are intended to kind of push people to the actual limits of what they could do, either physically or mentally or both. And other times the session is designed to leave something in the tank, to give people something that was not necessarily at the limits of what they can do, and to just be another brick in the wall, so to speak, of their training. So, when we have this question of, should I have done more in that given session? Should I have pushed harder? Should I have added more volume? I hesitate to say that this is something that athletes frame incorrectly, because that can be somewhat condescending. But I do think that's the case. I think that as a coach, it's not necessarily about, okay, you left something in the tank, so you did it wrong. It's like, okay, we're thinking about the big picture of your training cycle. And sometimes we do want something left in the tank. Other times we don't. And in this discussion, maybe we can frame why that might be relevant and when an athlete can think about, it being appropriate to push to that limit or to add more volume, or when they should have gone faster. So Luke, what do you think about this question?
Yeah, I think that it can be quite difficult sometimes for people to take a little bit more of an objective view around how they're approaching their training, especially with just the amount of media and the amount of messaging that is out there around people just training to the point where they fall apart, that they are lying on the floor, that they can't do any more, right? So they're training to failure. And there is a certain group of people out there who actually can just do that and can keep doing that. And I think that you have to also take into account someone's experience level, because if you do have someone who is a more experienced athlete, that they are more likely going to be able to gauge when they can do that and how they can do that, and they will have that sort of intuition built in to the point where they know, okay, if I'm going to push beyond this, then I'm probably going to be feeling it or feeling negatively about that the following day, whether they're really, really sore or whether their training is going to be affected the following day or the following few days. But I think that it's just trying to find that right balance between, as you said earlier when we were off recording, Todd, that balance between the minimum effective dose and then the sort of maximum tolerable dose, and just trying to make sure that you're hitting the right training stimulus. An example I see quite often is sometimes I'll give athletes a little bit of choice in terms of how they approach their session. So it'll be like, okay, you're doing 6 to 8 sets of this circuit for 2 minutes with rest built in, and try to make sure that you keep this consistent. If you drop beyond a certain rep range from one round to the next, then stop it from there. And you can sort of see the psychology behind it, when certain people will always just push to get the higher end of the volume done, and then some people will always go for the lower end, and you can sort of see obviously with the results there. But I think that you've got to make sure that bit by bit you are building up volume and intensity session to session, and progression to progression, and making sure that you are making improvements on your training, but also just take into consideration what is ahead of that. So it's not just focusing on the session that's right in front of you and trying to maximize that, thinking about where does that fit in the whole big picture. How long is this training cycle going on for? Where am I at within this training cycle? And I think that if you look to sort of build that over time. I think that's key. And, sometimes you see this in the actual design of the training. So sometimes you might actually see, okay, this week you're going to do 2 sets, next week you're going to do 3 sets, the following week you can do 4. And then you can, bit by bit, you can be like, all right, well, I've just got to repeat those efforts that I did in the previous weeks. And obviously I have this build up in volume. So you get a bit of a gist of it. And I think that, having some element of communication around how things are going to progress, having also an understanding of how training progresses. Because I do think that a lot of people, it's always about going faster, and it's always about going for higher weights and higher intensities, when sometimes training is actually just about accumulating reps under your belt and accumulating, minutes on your intervals and things like that.
I think it's something we've talked about before on that same line, Luke, that it's, not every training session is a competition. It's training, it's improving at stuff, it's getting better at stuff. And if you constantly take yourself to that, red line every session, you're not necessarily going to be improving on the things you need to improve on. So with, let's even say something like gymnastics, where we're doing some handstand push-up work. If you take yourself to absolute failure every day that you work on them, that's not necessarily the best way to get better. And the same for conditioning. If you redline yourself every day, you don't learn about pacing, you don't learn about how to control a workout. And I do a similar thing to what you were saying there, Luke, in the sense that there are sometimes maybe an EMOM that I'll set for someone. But I will say, if you start to fall off the pace a little after this round, you're going to take 2 minutes of rest and then finish the rest of it out. Because I don't want them to go to the point of having to, get above 90, 95% effort to finish it. It's supposed to have a little more element of control there. And I think, especially in a group setting, there can be a tendency for people to go above what they want to do or what they should do for a workout. I have a number of people I coach that I'm working on barbell cycling with, and it's always a discussion to get them to take a hit to their ego of, yeah, your time's going to be a little bit slower because you could do this faster if you did singles, but there is better long-term benefit for you to practice your cycling and get better at cycling. And so, holding back that ego a little bit to allow yourself the chance to get better, even if your result for that day isn't as good.
Yeah, I think that it's probably worth trying to dig into the ideas of minimum effective dose, maximum tolerable dose, diminishing returns, and other such esoteric concepts that I'll try to explain in an audio format where visual might actually be better. But, if we think about a graph, let's say, right, and on the x-axis, we have either volume or intensity, right? And then on the y-axis, we sort of have like training benefit, somewhat nebulous aggregation of all possible benefits to a specific trait. We can use John's barbell cycling capacity as an example, right? And so if we think about as volume and intensity go up, the training benefit for most people is going to be very, very low for a while, right? Because if you're not actually exceeding your capacity in what you can currently do, you're not going to get much training benefit from it. So there's going to be very, very low training benefit for a while. Then at some point you kind of hit this minimum effective dosage of volume or intensity where training benefit suddenly starts to go up, right? It's like, okay, I'm actually past the threshold where I'm challenging my system to the point that it's going to have to adapt to what I'm doing, right? So you cross that minimum effective dose, training benefit starts to go up. And then there's another point where we actually have the kind of like maximum tolerable dose, where that training benefit starts to suddenly potentially plummet because you're going to get hurt, you're going to get injured, and simultaneously you're also going to be plateauing in terms of the benefit that's possible, right? Because with most things like this, once you cross that minimum effective dose, you're going to get like a pretty steep curve of benefit, but then that's going to suddenly start to level off, right? So you can sort of think like an S-shaped curve where it goes up in a pretty aggressive fashion, and then it levels off because you've kind of like sucked up all the gains, so to speak. If you think about growth of most businesses, it follows a similar trajectory, or like utilization of a technology or something like that, where it's like, okay, whatever this new widget is rolled out, this new app is rolled out, it grows very, very rapidly as everyone who wants to use it suddenly starts using it. It spreads virally. It's growing, with a quote unquote exponential curve. Then all of a sudden it's like, well, you've saturated the market and there's nowhere else for you to grow. So you sort of get this flattening of the curve, right? So we want to cross the minimum effective dose. We don't want to hit the maximum tolerable dose because we suddenly start to see plummeting there. And then simultaneously, we need to think about, okay, at some point, this curve is going to level off in terms of the potential gain that we can get. So we don't want to be essentially spending too much energy on volume and intensity if the marginal return is low, right? So this is kind of like a tricky optimization problem. And it's not like we're calculating this while we're writing people's programs or anything. But, this is sort of like the framework that I think can actually be helpful for people. So we want to be above the minimum effective dose. We want to be below the maximum tolerable dose. And depending on the athlete and what they're trying to work on, we want to push as far up that potential gains curve as we can get without spending a bunch of, recovery hit points, so to speak, for just like marginal gains that aren't necessarily that valuable, right? So again, that's a little bit, overly analytical and not necessarily helpful for an athlete trying to think about this. But for a coach, it's like, I think John was mentioning, we want to maybe make some sacrifices in short-term performance or short-term volume and intensity accumulation in order to progress long-term. And by repeatedly finding the right spot on that like gains relative to volume and or intensity, then we can maximize the long-term benefit to that athlete, right? And one other thing that I think is probably worth pointing out is that this is for optimal training benefit over time. This is not necessarily for sport-specific adaptation or potentially the psychological training or exposure needed to compete in a sport that does sort of, require a decent amount of adaptability and pain tolerance and just like dealing with bullshit, right? So there's like a whole separate conversation that's like, all right, you're going to go into this competition and you're going to get no rep and you're going to have to, lift weights in a lane that's kind of like tilted awkwardly, and your judge is going to, not be communicating clearly and like all the things that go wrong, and that being able to be prepared and tolerant of that type of stuff, that's a separate conversation where you're not trying to sort of like find the sweet spot on the volume, intensity, and benefit curve. You're just like, all right, we're just going to fuck with you and assume that you're adaptable enough that you're going to be able to figure it out.
Yeah, like I think it adds in another layer of complexity with, the idea that when people are competing, they are performing at their maximum and they're trying to achieve the best desired result as they can. And usually it's under, pretty difficult situations and conditions. Just to circle back to the point of like the minimum and effective dose and maximum tolerable dose, to give maybe like one example of a sport where there doesn't actually have this sort of element of competition as such is, I know that the Renaissance periodization and juggernaut training systems, they're very big on essentially moving from one to the other by counting the amount of sets that an athlete does over time, or the amount of fatiguing sets that an athlete does over time in, say, powerlifting, weightlifting, or bodybuilding. So that's obviously a lot less variables than exists within CrossFit, but that build up over, say, for instance, a training cycle is a matter of adding a set or adding, just a little bit of heavier weight to the same amount of volume over time. And it's a lot more simple. And I think one of the challenges that exists as well is just trying to bridge the gap from training progressions where you're trying to get someone to really focus on getting the best stimulus that they can, sort of creating a good base layer, and then layering in stuff that's going to be focusing on more sport specific type stuff. To sort of give you an example, this is just off the top of my head because I actually wrote out some progressions today, but it's, you could be working off of a RPE on some rowing, and then an RPE on a heavy barbell, a couplet that you're going to be doing every, say, 4 to 5 minutes, and then the following, you're then going to be working at a specified weight and a specified distance to sort of add in that similar idea of training for competition, training for sort of more sport specific means, and then eventually getting to the point where you do that in, say, a 20-minute AMRAP format or something along those lines. So I think that a lot of people find it difficult to train when things can be a little bit esoteric, and it's like, okay, just do this at a tough weight where you are able to maintain good speed and good mechanics throughout. And, you know, in their head, they're constantly thinking about, well, a barbell in a workout is always going to be 135 pounds, 185 pounds, or 225. So I've got to pick one of those. I can't really go in between. And I think one of the things I like to tell my athletes to do is just constantly focus on, you know, chasing a stimulus and not necessarily the result, and doing that for a long period of time. I think that, you know, you could apply something like the 80-20 rule where, you know, 80% of your training away from competition needs to be focused around building a good volume base and building good training so that you can actually develop over a long period of time. 20% of it probably needs to be touches on the sport where you are putting yourself into difficult situations and you're practicing the things that are going to be coming up in competition. And then when you are in a pre-competition phase, you probably switch that, and you're probably focusing 80% of your time on doing workouts that are similar to what is going to come up in a competition, and then 20% of the time focusing on maintaining a strength base, maintaining a good engine base, and then repeating that process, but bit by bit, just trying to make sure that you're getting more out of your training without actually just ending yourself session to session. And I think that, you know, this is the bigger difference as well between doing classes and going into training for competition, because a lot of the time in CrossFit gyms, you know, there is it's sort of somewhat glorified to, you know, finish your workout lying on the floor and everyone's clapping and pushing the person who's struggling to finish towards the end, and it's like, you know, everyone is going as hard as they can, and there's a lot of there's a lot of positive energy around that approach to training. And then when you start training and all of a sudden your volume is up and you're being a lot more specific because you're training for the sport, you have to change your perspective and your outlook on how you approach things.
So coming back around to that idea of kind of people wanting to do extra work because they feel like they have more energy at the end of a session. What are your guys' opinions on kind of like map 10 or map 9, 8, maybe 7 type work, where if someone feels like, yeah, I have more time today, I feel pretty good, I want to do some more, and just working on that kind of aerobic base, something that is not going to have too much carryover into the next day or the next week of training, but is going to allow them to make some meaningful progress on something.
John, what are your opinions?
I mean, personally, I like it. So, you know, if it's the end of a session and someone has more time and it's like, okay, go sit on the bike for 30 minutes and, you know, move at a 55% pace, and just try and go nonstop for 30 minutes at that same pace. I think there's a lot of benefit to that, both from a recovery standpoint of the session they've just completed and that aerobic development for the conditioning aspect, whether it's higher intensity or lower intensity work.
Yeah, I just did an episode with Sergio for Science with Sergio that actually, I don't know if this is going to come out before or after that one, but we dissected a paper talking a lot about you know, the sort of mitochondrial ability to metabolize lactate, and it was kind of in the weeds and some of the science stuff there. And I think there's, to your point, John, like a huge benefit to this kind of moderate intensity zone 2 work for a lot of athletes in conditioning sports, right? And essentially zone 2 is heart rate terminology, but the idea is it's kind of like it's above like an easy walking pace, but it's well below anything that's actually difficult, especially for people in a sport like CrossFit, where, you know, that you know, we prescribe stuff to people and we're like, okay, do this at, 85% effort. And, their 85% effort is really pretty close. Like they're falling apart at the end. Their row paces are catastrophically falling apart. And it's like, okay, well, that was not 85% effort, right? I think that the RPE, like rate of perceived exertion calibration, is a little bit off in our community. So there are some challenges there. But John, I do agree that there's potentially huge benefit to fitness athletes to be doing more of that zone 2 type of work, both because it improves their mitochondrial capacity, potentially gives them some more ability to tolerate more volume in other types of training sessions, potentially allows them to do more work aerobically in some of the stuff that they're doing. And I especially think that if you couple that with some moderate intensity skill work or movement work, right, which is something that I think a lot of CrossFitters need to be doing, right, where it's like, hey, here's if you feel like you have more in the tank and you want to do more stuff, great, spend 30 minutes, do 2 minutes on the bike erg, then 1 minute bear crawl, 2 minutes on the bike erg, 1 minute half Turkish get-ups on the right side, 2 minutes on the bike erg, 1 minute half Turkish get-ups on the left side, right? And if you just like come up with a 15-minute block like that and repeat it twice, you're doing zone 2 work essentially and some scapular motor control focused accessory work. Like that's actually a pretty good use of people's time and energy if they want to add more to their training that isn't necessarily going to be, like I said before, taking away from their recovery hit points, so to speak. It might actually even be adding to it over time.
Yeah, I have a number of athletes who I program a piece like that for one of their days. Usually I like to do it on like a Tuesday where they've had a particularly hard Monday, they have a tough Wednesday session, and they'll still be doing other work alongside that in their training, but it is more allowing them to work on the aerobic development. And it's not something I necessarily do in a competition season. It is more developing that aerobic base for building up higher intensity pieces when it comes to more of the competition season, however that looks for people.
Yeah, like I think there's a lot that people within CrossFit can take from more traditional sports, especially more sort of skill-based sports. So, when people finish training, for instance, in basketball, they're going to shoot a load of free throws, or say, for instance, kick a load of goals. If they're finished up rugby practice, doing that type of stuff, incorporating that with some low-level aerobic activity can be really, really beneficial. What I think is, one thing I would say is that people just have to make sure that they've got everything in check before they do that stuff, because I think that sometimes what I have noticed is that people are very, very keen to do extra stuff, but then they, for instance, don't pay attention to how they recover. They don't have their food prepped, and they're not necessarily optimizing other areas that are going to affect their training and affect the success of adapting to training for a long term, as much as they are for training itself. It's almost, okay, I'm in the gym for 2 hours a day, but then the 22 hours in the rest of the day aren't necessarily all geared up and pointing towards this training goal that you may have. So I'm fairly careful with how I put that type of stuff in. I have definitely put in, like, for instance, especially with coaches who, are just at the gym for longer, putting in optional AM sessions or optional additional work to do, and really trying to make sure that they understand that it's optional. And then that type of stuff is generally looking at easy aerobic work, carries, like around the world type stuff. So they're just moving through movement patterns that they don't necessarily hit when they're doing their typical thrusters and pull-ups, and just trying to make sure that they have a little bit more movement variability and sort of longevity in their training over time. And I found that to be quite useful. But then again, if people are, I have seen a lot of the time, and I think I've been guilty of this myself as well, where it's like, I ask to do extra work, but then I don't necessarily complete everything within the week on the other stuff. So I think that you have to sort of be careful in that sense. And just to sort of, go a little bit further on that point, if, say, for instance, people feel that they are not putting everything into their training because they are, dropping the ball as such on their sort of adherence to their training program, to their sort of nutrition and sleep protocols and things like that, if they feel like they actually need to, push themselves into a hole at the end of every session because they don't have those other areas in line, then I think that people obviously have to make sure that they take a bit of a step back and get a little bit more aligned before they then start to feel the need to do that. Because I think if someone does feel like they're not training hard enough, it's like, okay, why do you feel that? Try and get to the bottom of it, and then if it seems to be like a logical step, adding in some additional work just to get in a little bit more practice and some more breathing, and just to create a bigger basis of support so they can adapt and recover within session and session to session more. I think that it can be really, really useful.
So we've been sort of saying that a lot of times it's okay and even encouraged for athletes to feel like they have something in the tank at the end of a session, but there's potentially times where that's not okay, right? Where we did want someone to push to their limit, right? And then the other aspect of that as well is that if an athlete is not actually hitting the minimum effective dose, like I was saying before, to actually create training adaptation, that's not going to be beneficial for them either. So how do you guys recognize when you may have someone that does need to potentially push harder during their sessions, or who is kind of leaving something on the table by not doing as much as they could, provided they have, like you said, Luke, a lot of stuff dialed in and ready to potentially handle more training volume?
I think that sometimes I'll notice that, given sort of certain challenges in training, something might come up. Something may, whether it's actually skipping the piece altogether, or whether, say for instance, that person is just, I don't like sandbagging it for whatever reason, and they're, not necessarily putting in the intensity that they need to. Or say for instance, if the training piece is written at like a very, very typical CrossFit workout, you got 12-minute AMRAP of this, and this, and then they sort of say that they were like, I was just, going for like an 80 to 85% range. I think that sometimes though, there's a lot of education around that. I see people making huge jumps in working weights. So they have like a 3x5, and then, they literally only do one heavy set, and there's like a sort of 40% range on the range of weights that they're using. So I think that there's actually sometimes it's like, okay, you actually need to just have this range, within 10 kilos or so. But yeah, the one I do see is just something usually comes up or gets in the way on those training pieces that are generally going to challenge them quite a bit. Or, sometimes they might just like go at it a little bit too hard and sort of don't necessarily pace it at all. And because I think, and then end up blowing up, because I do think that it's actually psychologically a lot harder just to be, holding a pace that is uncomfortable but sustainable for a long period of time. And then if you've got it at the end, you can have a bit of a kick. Is actually quite taxing to go through that mentally as well. Just trying to sort of have the discipline within that. But that is a huge part of the sport, and the people who are really, really successful have either spent a long time practicing that, or they just naturally have that built within them. But yeah, I think that, to give people the benefit of the doubt, I think a lot of it is based around education, and people usually change things up once they're sort of given a bit more guidance around it. I'm not too sure that they're sort of shouting at them over the internet, telling them to, put the effort in or something like that is going to be useful, but just sort of giving them a little bit more guidance and just being like, okay, you'll try this next time and sort of see how that feels.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think when people are leaving something on the table in terms of, the amount of effort or volume or intensity they were able to put forth on a given day, it's often more because of mistakes, like you said, right? Where it's just like the way that they try to load something is just completely wrong and doesn't allow them to actually, get in whatever the 3 difficult working sets on their back squat because they tried to take some crazy jump, right? Or it's some sort of EMOM weightlifting thing and they dramatically undershoot because they're a little nervous about being able to repeat it. And it's like, yo, come on, like this is this one was supposed to be heavy, not skill work, right? And like some of that's on the coach for not clarifying, but I see that as a potential way that people are like leaving stuff on the table. And I think that you mentioned the other one, which is pacing, right? Which is like, if you completely screw up your pacing, it's kind of interesting because like really badly screwing up your pacing almost makes a session not feel that hard, because you just kind of can't do it. If you're like, cool, you have these, whatever. I had something like this recently where I was coming back from some time off, and I did my first conditioning session in the gym with a mask after a few weeks, and it was several 10-minute repeats, right? It was like starting with rowing and then finishing with some other stuff. And I thought I picked a pace that was going to be fine. Like, it was like, this should be a little bit challenging, but I'll be okay. And I just couldn't do it. Like, I was completely cooked, a few minutes into my second of 5 repeats. And it was hard because I completely blew up, but it wasn't hard in the same way that if I had done the 5 repeats at appropriate intensity, it would have been hard. Right? It was hard in the sense that like it was very uncomfortable and I sucked. It wasn't hard in the sense that I was like pushing. I just couldn't. It was like, cool, I can't hold my pace anymore. I'm fucking sucking this, disgusting wet mask down my throat with every breath. Like, I can barely string together double unders. Like, this is a disaster. And I certainly felt like I had more in the tank after that session, even though I kind of couldn't, because I had just, dramatically overshot what would have been a reasonable pace for me coming off of a break and doing conditioning with a mask on. So, that's the other way that I think people potentially leave something on the table, is just, again, making like a training mistake, so to speak.
Okay, so to sum it up, I think we've established that Todd needs to train more frequently to avoid sucking in workouts. But really, I mean, it is that.
John, how many times have you worked out this week?
3.
That's actually pretty good.
Yeah.
How many times did you work out last week?
3.
John, I'm impressed.
How many hours are you in the gym a week? 3?
Probably more like 55, 60. So
several. It's many.
I'm just glad you didn't go back another week, Todd, because that would have been different. I mean, so I think really to summarize what we've gone through today, the idea of leaving something in the tank and not completely giving 100% of your energy for the day into that session is really dependent on your ability to recover and knowing your body as part of that, knowing your ability within workouts and holding yourself back to the point where you can come in the next day and hit a good session. And you know that it's not going to ruin the rest of your week if you try and do that a little bit more, if you try and add in an extra piece of work or go a little bit heavier than you should, or have the intensity a little bit higher in a workout. And really kind of finding that balance between what is the effective minimum dose of training and finding out what is overtraining, and trying to hit that sweet spot where you're making progress, you're making the most of your time, but we're not going too far over the edge, and essentially looking from a macro perspective of a week's training or a 6 weeks training, and making sure that you're able to get the most out of that length of training and not just a singular day. And a lot of that comes down to experience and knowing yourself, and also watching your results and, tracking your progress across an extended period of time to make sure you're moving everything in the right direction and not just relying on a singular day's results and progress.
Thanks for listening. While you're here, go ahead and head over to your podcast player, subscribe to the show, give it a rating, give it a review, all that good stuff. You can also go ahead and click through to the show notes where you can find out more about us at legionsc.com, and also follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.